This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Bloomberg News Mark Bergen discusses his book, Like, Comment, Subscribe. He speaks about the creation and growth of YouTube and how it has changed our society.
This media platform that's really, despite its size and influence, just not had the same level of attention as some of its peers. And I thought within that story that you have plenty of fascinating characters on YouTube, and then inside the company you have this whiplash of going from the underdog to sort of seen as big tech and seen as something that associated with a lot of problems in democracy.
He's interviewed by Politico technology policy reporter Rebecca Kern.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Hey, Mark, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it was a really fun read, and I kind of wanted to just jump into the conversation. I have a lot of questions. But just to start off, I wanted to just see if you can explain kind of what inspired you to write the book. Obviously, you've written on Google and YouTube for years. But like, what led you to decide this is something I need to write a whole book about?
So I have been covering Google since 2015, and then it became Alphabet, and really it's an expanding kind of business conglomerate and empire. And during that time, YouTube, its media division, became increasingly important for the company's bottom line. It also became increasingly important for the company's political hurdles and some of their major business problems in the past 7 years. And so during that time, I was reporting on a lot of the major crises that YouTube and its parent company dealt with, sort of fire after fire. And what I saw was a really fascinating, in a short period of time, this whiplash where you have these employees at Google and YouTube who see themselves as an underdog to traditional media, to traditional corporate world and Hollywood. And then within a few short years, the Google and YouTube is viewed almost equivalent to big tobacco. And you've seen the social media backlash. Google's faced intense amount of unprecedented political scrutiny. I thought this was a fascinating story about this media platform that's really, despite its size and influence, just not had the same level of attention as some of its peers. And I thought within that story that you have plenty of fascinating characters on YouTube, and then inside the company you have this whiplash of going from the underdog to sort of seen as big tech and seen as something that associated with a lot of problems in democracy.
Right, yeah. And I'm curious who you were able to speak with at the company. I mean, who they gave you access to and how you got all this inside baseball information for the book.
Yeah, I mean, I came to the company since day one that I was writing this. That this was I wanted it to be a definitive, genuine, and accurate depiction of the company's operations, what it's gone through, and how it's responded. And I think my case to them was, YouTube is uniquely situated in the problems they face, in part because they have this major creator economy. They're the only platform for a very long time that paid creators, paid broadcasters, and so they have this gigantic financial engine that has ramifications for people's professional lives. And that's, I think, just characterized a lot of the challenges they went through. So I spoke to about a dozen folks sort of officially with the company. This is ranging from everyone on, marketing roles to engineering to product, up to the number 2 at the company. In my additional reporting, I spoke to over 100 people that have either worked there or had work in the past in a variety of roles, basically talking to anyone who's willing to share their time and their story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what I found was interesting is you cited a Google employee who said they viewed YouTube as the video scaffolding of the internet, and that also it is the number 2 search engine behind Google. And I just think that was kind of surprising information for me. Can you kind of share kind of how that, you're talking about the underdog, aspect. I don't know how widely known that YouTube is a search engine itself even.
That was one of the driving forces behind why Google scooped it up.
Yeah.
It was early in YouTube's life. So it was 18 months after it started in October of 2006. Google agrees to buy YouTube for $1.6 billion, which at the time was just an enormous sticker shock for the financial world, for the media world, for people inside Google. Certainly, YouTube by then had already had sort of enormous success finding an audience with viewers. It had already started to become part of the wider pop culture firmament, but Google really saw YouTube as a fantastic search property, and in that way as a threat, in the sense that Google wants to become the best and premier search engine to remain on the internet. It saw YouTube. People were going to YouTube to look for just entertaining clips to pass the time and idle entertainment, as well as how-to videos and seeking information in the same way that in commercial queries, the same way they would go to Google. That hasn't changed. I mean, YouTube has only become stronger and deeper as a search platform, right? It's sort of, we've all had this experience where it's remarkable that like any specific thing that we're looking to do, whether it's like fix a small part of your car or bake a recipe, there is probably a YouTube video out there that explains how to do it. It means that there's someone who's taken the time to upload that video and potentially made money from it. It's just the breadth of the platform is really hard to come to terms with.
Right, and it's birthed the creator economy. And you've alluded to that, but can you kind of explain the significance of that and how it's really set the stage for all these other social media apps that have now started paying their creators? I'm thinking TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Snap, but it really was the original there, and how that evolved over time.
Yeah, I mean, YouTube sort of invented a new form of fame. Like we now have online personalities who are more recognizable to generations and teenagers and kids and people in their 20s than Hollywood A-listers. And that has been the case maybe for the past decade. YouTube began very early, remarkably early in 2007, sharing the ad revenue from its site with a select group of popular creators. That started to expand and become professionalized relatively quickly. And then up to a point now where they've over 2 million people are on YouTube's ads partner program. That was actually a larger number a few years ago because the company had to call that back for a variety of reasons. But it's just this incredibly robust economy. It has launched like new media companies, many careers, and now you're seeing, especially during the pandemic, right, where creators became a really valuable valuable vehicle for companies to do marketing. Like influencers just became, these very popular and profoundly, they have a relationship with an audience that just celebrities on TV and conventional media don't necessarily. So we've seen Twitch, Snapchat, TikTok, all the Meta, Facebook properties, Spotify in particular, are all kind of hurling money at this creator class in this war for talent that's been happening. And I only see it in its early stages right now.
Totally. And going back to kind of the basis of YouTube itself, you referred to it as like the three-legged stool of audience, creator, and advertising. But throughout the book, you mentioned so many tensions between those three factors and how often the creator is left as the most uneven stool, even though they, as we're referring to it, they are the basis of YouTube. They are what created YouTube. So could kind of talk about some of those tensions and how they changed over time?
Yeah, it's a wobbly stool for sure.
Yeah.
It's, you'll talk to advertisers and they think that creators are sometimes coddled on the platform and in some circumstances, like given more latitude than an advertiser, certainly like a more cautious conservative advertiser would want. The other constituency is the viewer, and I think you can, from my reporting shows that you can clearly make the argument that what YouTube has done for viewers is this amazing, massive free entertainment and information that never existed 2 decades before, and we kind of take advantage of now. But it's also there's not a lot of transparency for you as a viewer. And I'll give like one interesting example. So the past few years, as YouTube has responded to a lot of criticism, they've instituted this policy called what they call borderline videos. And so these are videos that don't break their rules about hate speech or harassment, graphic violence, and supporting kind of extremist positions, but they go right up to the line of them, and this is a really arbitrary line, and what YouTube has done is a pretty powerful tool, which is, okay, we're just not going to put those videos in our recommendation engine. So it's the traffic on those, once they're removed from the YouTube recommendation system, it really plummets, because that is a majority of views on videos is people being recommended footage, either just kind of autoplay, one video jumps to the next, or that panel of videos on the screen if you're looking at a desktop computer. Me, as a viewer, I have no idea that this video in front of me has been deemed borderline. I have no idea this video, is potentially violating some rules or in questionable territory, and that creators at the same time don't necessarily have that indication either, and that's sort of the part of the reason, one of many reasons why the creators feel shortchanged, especially compared to traditional media, which is also on YouTube.
Right, and that all kind of came to a head, you talk about in the book, in 2017 with the adpocalypse, you call it. And just that was just talking about the tensions with some violent extremist content being promoted on the platform by certain creators, and that being tied to advertisers who do not want to obviously be associated with that content. Other examples of, videos that were also viewed as offensive that ads were still running on. So could you kind of talk about maybe what led to that and what, there were some pretty dramatic changes that happened after that time period?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things going on. One is sort of wonky business, right? Like Google is a digital advertising company. Like it makes its majority of its money putting ads in front of your search results and then putting ads across the web, either on website banners or on YouTube videos. This has been a business model that has fundamentally reshaped how marketing works. And it kind of took this, what traditionally was like a handshake agreement on Madison Avenue, literally. I'm a company and I want my ad to run on this TV station and this show or on this billboard, right? What YouTube did, or what Google did, was it just upended that, and it said, like, we'll serve your ad to where it will reach the best consumer. What that did was and then they will do it in an automated way. So they built this fantastically complex automated system equivalent to sort of a financial market, that with all these exchanges and markets and basically a lot of software to determine when to serve you an ad that you're most likely to click on. So what happened in 2017 was there were reporters that found that some of the major household brands and names and even nonprofits were sponsoring terrorist videos, extremists, neo-Nazis, the type of inappropriate material that if you sat down a chief marketing officer and said, you're spending money on this, they clearly would not want to continue doing so, and they didn't want their names in the headlines associated with that. And this was, it was a relatively small percentage of the budget, but it just demonstrated how this model had been built so quickly, and wasn't prepared to deal with the kind of avalanche of advertisers exiting.
Right, and then after that, they did end up having to change some of their business and digital advertising modeling, and also it led to some major changes in how they moderate content, I think, as well.
This was also, I guess, the second point was this was the beginning early in the Trump presidency in the era, and you had major advertisers that were much more cautious about, and I'd say even venture to say like did not want to go anywhere near remotely political issues and topics, and then you have YouTube and Google that also wanted to steer clear of anything kind of remotely political. They were the beginnings of this accusation that the company has a bias against conservatives in the U.S. So their response was pretty. I would say it was pretty severe. Like the number of changes they made, and YouTube now versus YouTube in 2017 looks profoundly different. And they put in effectively like safeguards and systems to make sure that their advertising business would continue to operate, and on some level that has worked very well. Like that, the earliest numbers we have for YouTube's financials from the company is that in 2017 they made $8 billion. Last year they made close to $29 billion in advertising. It's been phenomenal growth, and so at least on one metric, they have satisfied advertisers. There's certainly open questions about whether or not they've satisfied regulators or concern from parents. Right. So you name it.
Right, and speaking of the use of AI tools, they're obviously deployed in advertising. They're deployed in the recommendation systems, but also around the 2017, I think, time period, they were deploying it to automatically moderate content too. Because it seemed obviously more and more content was getting on the platform and never saw a human review initially. So could you kind of talk about the evolution of content moderation? And we'll talk about YouTube Kids next as an example of where they really had to build it up there.
The content moderation, there's a really telling anecdote in the book that YouTube's early team, they hired these early moderators directly on staff. They call it the squad, which stands for an acronym, and hopefully I get this right. It's like safety and quality of users. Forgive me for not getting it exactly right, but
I remember squad. Yeah,
it's detailed in the book. But these were like sort of the first like frontline workers of the internet, right? This was in 2005, 2006, which was when there was just beginning to have what we call user-generated content. And this proliferation of material that was, to your point, not programmed, unfiltered, and they had teams and like wrote these rules, and they were, I think, pretty adaptive given the fact that they were in some ways inventing this on the fly. One interesting example is there was early on this trend on the internet of like what's called thinspiration. So it's women, young girls posting videos like pro-anorexia material. And so there are people on YouTube's policy team early on that identified this. And so like this is a trend that we do not want on our community, right? We don't want videos promoting this. And not for like at this point, keep in mind like YouTube basically didn't have a commercial business, or it was like very nascent. And they then outlawed this practice, or at least set rules. Rather, they restricted it as far as restricting it for younger viewers. Of course, there's a big gap in the history of YouTube, like all internet platforms, between the rules that they write and what actually happens on the site. And that enforcement is incredibly difficult. It's very difficult in video. Like YouTube has a unique problem that Facebook and Twitter have not had. Because Facebook and Twitter are largely text-based, and it's the way that software works right now. It is far easier to immediately analyze text and identify, like if you're looking for certain keywords. It is much harder to do that in a long video, and you also have to deal with visuals as well as audio. So at a certain point, YouTube's size began to, I think, just grew too large for the moderation team. They started to outsource this operation in late 2017 after like this series of business crises and more increasing regulatory pressure. They basically went out and hired thousands of contract moderators to build up the team that they sort of still work with today.
Right. Yeah, and that was really novel. I think what kind of inspired the more dramatic human intervention, I think you explained, was with ElsaGate in the YouTube Kids era. If you want to kind of describe broadly what that means. I mean, it sounded like adults dressing up in kind of a Comic-Con look of Elsa was obviously from Frozen, if someone did not know that. And taking advantage of, keywords in the tagging, but also doing activities that kids should not be seeing, it seemed like. So that seemed to have gotten out of control for probably too long, because it sounded like YouTube Kids, there wasn't really, it was a platform, but in theory, YouTube wanted parents to be watching it with their children, but the reality was children were watching it unsupervised. So could you kind of explain the outcome of that in the end, I guess?
Yeah, so because of the way that internet laws work, this is basically like, the only way that YouTube was restricted by copyright from day one, and that it had COPPA, the restriction on like what type of targeting and data you can collect from minors under 13. And for that reason, the site was very explicitly, I don't know how explicit it was, because it was the terms of service that, as we know on the internet, like few people actually read. But it's like, this is for a site for 13 and over. If you're a kid under 13, you are watching with your parents. And it was 2015. By 2015, there was just so much abundant material on YouTube that was clearly aimed for toddlers and kids younger than 13. What the company did is they built an app called YouTube Kids, and this was their attempt to say this is sort of to make a safe space for children. I think for a variety of reasons that has not taken off, and I think the traffic on that is just minuscule compared to YouTube.com. They were criticized pretty early on from some outside watchdog groups because they didn't curate and like hand pick the videos that were going in. There were videos in there that like certainly parents found inappropriate. That became really in 2017 when there was just so much of videos that were designed to get kids to watch. And enough people at YouTube decided this was like inappropriate and not something, to be honest, that they would want their children to watch. I think that was a major turning point in the company. And keep in mind, I think like they were aware that this was putting them close to like uncomfortable territory as far as regulation. Right,
and you have quotes from Susan Wojcicki, the CEO, saying, this was not what it was intended to do. And obviously she directed the hiring of, the goal was 10,000 content moderators, humans moderating.
That was for Google-wide.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
It was one of the frustrating moments where YouTube tends to like announce a figure like that.
I was like, that was a very large number.
You read the fine print, and it's. I think it was mostly YouTube, but Google also has teams that moderate Google Search and Google Images and so on. So but, forgive me for that.
Oh no, thanks for clarifying that. But ultimately, like it puts a lot of the burden on these content moderators who are contractors. And I think maybe people aren't aware they don't get the big salaries and benefits of Google and YouTube employees, and often work in different parts of the world. Could you kind of talk about the difficulties this put on these individuals and kind of the blowback that inadvertently happened in the end with that?
Yeah, it is to your point, like a lot of them are contracted out so to vendors that Google hires rather than being full-time YouTube employees. The company says that the reason they do that is because they just want to hire people very quickly, which is in a sense it's accurate that like the way that YouTube tends to hire people takes some time for their hiring. So there, for one, certain types of content, and I talked to people who had these jobs, right? Their job was to, YouTube calls it VE, violent extremism. Like, this is some of the most graphic violence, and a lot of it is, YouTube's goal here is to build software that can detect all of this without any human intervention. But there are things that obviously fall through the cracks. There are really just strange calls that a machine can't detect when they're not someone's. It's a macabre anecdote, but there was something in the story about a moderator I spoke to who watched this video and it looked like a beheading video, but it ended up someone was using a toothbrush instead of a knife, and so that technically doesn't violate the rules, but it is traumatic. The videos about child exploitation is another area where, for regulatory reasons, and I think just the company obviously does not want that material on its site, but there are people that have to moderate it if it's not been flagged by automated systems. And YouTube has built up the most advanced system for automating and moderating, and the stat they share is something on the order of more than 90% of videos that break the rules are taken down by its software system rather than moderators. But it's still, you're right, it relies on moderators who are trying to understand rule books that the company writes, basically trying to train machines to operate a particular way, and many of them have fairly traumatic jobs.
Right. I think one of the most significant examples of violent content that made it onto the platform was the Christchurch shooting in 2019. And even in the book, Neil Mohan, their content lead of content, was saying that the tragedy itself was almost designed for the purpose of going viral. Because while it may have been uploaded initially on Facebook, clips of it were reshared on YouTube constantly and taken down. And that was a big battle to get control of that. How would you say they've managed since then? I mean, it's just a constant whack-a-mole battle. It seems not just YouTube. All these platforms face kind of that same challenge.
Tragically, we have another example more recent to sort of demonstrate the Buffalo shooting, which operated in bleak, almost a similar sort of manifesto inspiration of and about white supremacist. From my understanding, YouTube did not. They did have people re-uploading that footage. I think there was less volume, and I think the company is much more prepared now.
Right.
This is just I think, to be honest, it's we can kind of accuse them of being naive, but certainly no one, when they started the company, expected someone to live stream their mass shooting. It's just in some ways it's unfathomable. And that was, I think, what's really compelling about the book is that it is a company that's dealt with the darkest parts of humanity.
Right. Yeah, I know exactly. And I do feel like the founders who you talk about, and we haven't really discussed the founders. So kind of talk about what their intent of the platform was, and obviously they are no longer with the platform. So it seems to have gone in a different direction with advertising, but did seem like the intent was just to share videos among family and friends, and a pretty, maybe naive, but, obviously a good intent for good. Obviously when it gets larger, it's less in control. But, I'd love to hear more about the founders and their personalities. And it seemed like Chris was the longest one who stuck with the company.
Oh, Chad?
Chad Hurley, yeah.
So there were three. They had all worked at PayPal before. It's where they met. And this was, this was a time in the internet of the dawn of Web 2.0. And so there were Flickr, MySpace. This was YouTube's early success was really dependent on MySpace. They kind of rode MySpace virality. It's hard to believe now, but Facebook was founded a few months before YouTube, and the central problem was that video file sharing on the internet was cumbersome, expensive, and they decided that there would be an interesting business opportunity to solve that. And to their credit, they did develop an incredibly simple and easy to use site. Like I think that's a major reason why YouTube beat out a lot of its competitors. My sense from talking, and I spoke to one of the founders, and I've talked to a lot of people who knew them and worked with them at the time. It's interesting. They're not as well known. So the third founder, Jawad Karim, left before Google acquired them. Steve Chen and Chad Hurley are the co-leaders of YouTube at the time. They both were gone by 2010. They're not obviously Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey at Twitter.
Right.
These entrepreneurs that have had a very sometimes tight control and vision. And the company sort of see, and certainly in Facebook's now Meta's case, it is a company run by one person. The YouTube founders, certainly had some. Probably Google took it in directions that they didn't love, but my sense is they were part of an era of the internet where you're solving a consumer need, which they did. They was sort of described as kind of this wild roller coaster ride, right? As soon as they joined Google, they're shipped around the world to open YouTube offices in Germany and Russia and in Japan and Korea, and it was this time of euphoria. Someone in the book calls it the Internet of Awesome, right?
Yeah.
And then we lead into the Arab Spring, which when we thought of social media. And it was a revolutionary force, a platform for documenting and witnessing real, actual revolutions and upheaval that traditional media, in a way that traditional media just and in countries with state-run media, that's where YouTube is an incredibly powerful force.
Right. And talk about kind of the leadership style under Susan Wojcicki, one of the few female CEOs in the tech world, and the influence she's had. I mean, she's been there 8 years, since 2014, seen some, a lot of changes, but still there. And I don't know if you have any sense how long she's planning to stay, but I'm curious how that's gone.
I don't have a sense.
Yeah.
I've heard varying... I'll tell you the varying stories I've heard in the sense that, on one extreme, people wonder, why she's still in that job. I mean, Google was founded in her garage. She is tight with the founders of Google, who have by now left the company. They're still the majority shareholders, but they're effectively retired. But they still have influence and sway. So she's in an inner circle of a company that has basically been run by inner circles. A YouTube CEO is a very difficult job. You have a lot of different constituencies you have to keep happy. They've improved this, but there was a point in time when, sort of during some of the crises, YouTubers found it. YouTubers, it's sort of a rite of passage that a YouTuber makes a video griping about YouTube, which is totally fair. But some YouTubers found, we could gripe about the CEO of this company, and she's a woman, and she's a Jewish woman. We can make harassing, we can make videos that were, I think, borderline harassment and anti-Semitic. Certainly ones that were not hard for me to find. So it is a difficult job. That being said, I've also heard the argument that is, that she has. YouTube as a business has been growing fairly well the past 5 years. They certainly have regulatory challenges, but they're not Facebook. Google's advertising business effectively keeps the fuel in that fire. So I think her record is certainly Wall Street is very happy with the direction that she's taken the platform. There are critics that will point out many blind spots, and I think people inside the company have admitted to me that they moved late on so many issues.
Right. And I'm thinking of, you're speaking of some of the sexism she personally faced, but within the company, there were allegations of sexual misconduct among staffers, among leadership and staffers, led to a November 2018 walkout. 20,000 staff across the company around the world participated, led by Claire Stapleton, who you interviewed and spoke with. It seemed like she was a big player in the book. So, and she even brought the concerns to Susan herself. So, but Claire's no longer there. So I'm wondering, like, how receptive you think YouTube has been to these concerns raised about sexism among employees.
So you mentioned that Claire Stapleton was a major character in the book. She's had this fascinating role at YouTube and at Google. I think that so the what I mentioned in the reporting in the book is in particular was around the discrepancies in salaries for female employees at YouTube and people of color. The Google reports those figures and still face criticism from, there's now an Alphabet workers union that regularly criticizes the company for that. There hasn't been any, to my knowledge, any reporting on harassment claims specifically at YouTube involving its executives. There's certainly it was part of the walkout. Some of there were certainly YouTube employees there, and half the actual walkout organizers worked at YouTube, and so I think they were in part. It's a part of Google that is more attuned to pop culture and to news just by virtue of the fact that it is a gigantic media platform.
Right, exactly. Well, moving forward, another big issue that the platform continues to struggle with is the spread of misinformation. We look back to 2020 and the spread of the big lie after the election results and the eventual banning of Donald Trump from the platform. But heading into the midterms and next year, how do you foresee the platform preparing to address misinformation? Do you see many changes in their midterm 22 plan that was announced the other week?
So to be clear, Trump is not banned per se, but he's actually indefinitely suspended.
Yeah, indefinitely
suspended.
Yes, I guess that's different.
And YouTube has said they consider reinstating once they feel like the threat of violence has subsided, which is an incredibly vague statement.
Right.
But my sense is that they, I'd be shocked if they moved before Facebook, which has given similar treatment to Trump. YouTube has made, this is an area where they've made some pretty dramatic changes in the sense that this type of policy around election misinformation didn't exist a few years ago.
Right.
This is not in the book, but I think that hopefully the sentiment it gets across. There are people I talk to who worked at YouTube who disagree with that policy. In part, YouTube is a global platform, and their argument was when there's a contested election in Venezuela, where do we as an American company land on this? I think that argument falls apart a little bit in the sense that the stakes of a U.S. election are different, and the idea being why operate in a country like Venezuela unless you're prepared to make that decision, but. That is, I think, captures something about how the company thinks, right? They moved pretty reluctantly to do this. What they haven't stated are rules around, you can't make videos giving false claims about how to vote, or you can't say the election's on Wednesday when it's actually on Tuesday.
Right.
You can't make threats of violence around, and now after. Certainly after Jan 6th and before then, but they've ramped up the pay more attention to this since after January 6th. There are rules about saying that the 2020 election is rigged, and there was a recent example where I believe Carrie Lake is the name of the elected official, the one who's running for office in Arizona.
Right.
And she was on a high-profile YouTuber named Steven Crowder, conservative pundit and commentator, over 6 million subscribers, has been a controversial and lightning rod on the platform. He had her on. It's sort of similar to a news show. He's a podcaster or talk radio host, and she was discussing the election and said it right out that it was rigged, and that video was removed, and then the account was suspended. Something that YouTube would not have done. I think they are a few years ago. I think going into the upcoming midterms, it'll be really interesting to see, where they draw the line as far as who is, would that, if she had said the same thing on Fox News, would they have treated that video differently? And I think so. I think YouTube has pretty reluctantly drawn lines where what they call authoritative channels, and so. C-SPAN's videos on YouTube, right? Like CNN, these sort of established media companies are higher in search rankings. They're trying to promote them more. You saw this during the election where there were a couple pro-Trump networks, Newsmax, One American News, that had fairly big audiences on YouTube, and YouTube would say at the time, listen, we are not putting any of their videos in our recommendation system. Like, viewers are finding this on their own. They're going out and searching for it. Oddly, like a lot of maybe not oddly, but a lot of those videos went viral on Facebook or Gab, on a right-wing social network. Not on YouTube itself. So that their approach is they're tweaking the rules and then doing as much as doing what they say they as much as they can around downranking any channels that would put them into, I think, difficulty around election misinformation. But it is an incredibly knotty problem for them that I don't think they've solved and maybe can't.
Right. No, I think it seems very challenging. But another area is how they work in other countries. So in Russia and in India or other environments where there is rules on certain speech and what you're allowed to say. And interestingly, after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, YouTube remains one of the few platforms allowed there in Russia. So Russia's kicked out a lot of the other platforms for not following their rules. So could you talk about kind of the dance, the song and dance YouTube does in other countries that don't have as strong of as wide of an allowance of free speech as the U.S. does?
I think that's a really fascinating. That is probably maybe the company's biggest challenge right now, and not getting enough attention. India is a really fascinating example. It's YouTube's biggest market. The stat they've shared most recently, and that was, I think, from 2020, is 325 monthly users. So that's the equivalent of the entire United States that's on YouTube.
325 million?
Right? Yeah. Monthly. And I'm sure the number is bigger. In part because TikTok is banned on YouTube. TikTok is banned in India.
Right.
And so, they've been paying more attention to misinformation, to hate speech, to harassment. It is complicated. India has dozens of languages, and caste is not. YouTube has recently written caste into their harassment policies, but it's difficult to moderate. But at the same time, you have the government, the BJP in India, that has been insisting that videos come down for violating misinformation or extremism rules. Some videos certainly fit this. Others appear to be just critical of the government. And so this is something that YouTube has dealt with a lot in the past, right? From almost day one in outside the U.S., right? Like they've been banned in Pakistan. They were banned in briefly in Thailand and Turkey, like countries where it felt like videos were being critical of in Thailand's case, the king, the ruling party, the government. YouTube has, for a long time, took pride in standing up to these countries. I think in countries like India now, because YouTube is so big, they have so much invested in so much at stake there. I have a hard time seeing them retreat.
Right.
I mean, Russia's another interesting example. Like they have taken down state media in Russia after the war in Ukraine. And I was one of many people that sort of fully expected Russia to block YouTube, and it has not yet. I think in part because YouTube is just so dominant there and part of the mainstream culture and entertainment complex that it seems to be one of the major reasons why it continues to operate. They're no longer running ads. They're ads business in Russia. But YouTube will point out often, and I think fairly, that the opposition in Russia has a big presence there, and that is a space where in countries with either state control of media or something equivalent, YouTube can be a powerful platform for opposition.
Yeah, you're saying Navalny's account is one of the largest, in fact, his followers. So yes, I mean, that seems to be another reason why it's so widely used in Russia at this time. But
dash cams are also really popular. Like a lot of cars in Russia have dash cams, and so you have like some of the most entertaining dash cam footage coming out of it. And they're big online personalities there.
Funny. Yeah.
YouTube remains, despite all, like it certainly has everything under the sun, but there's like music, gaming, beauty, like those categories are gigantic.
Right. Another area I wanted to talk about was, what he says in the book, one of our biggest fears is regulation, and it really wasn't until September 2019 they saw their biggest fine from the FTC, $170 million, which really isn't that much for a YouTube, but the largest FTC has fined to date for violating the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act. Could you talk about the significance of that and the ramifications?
I mean, one significance is it's really been to date like the only U.S. regulator to crack down on big tech in a meaningful way. Congress hasn't passed anything so far, and despite many proposals, I think we've seen at the state level around privacy, and but this had a significant immediate effect on YouTube. And so, like, one of it is something that viewers can see, right? If you go on if you like go a nursery rhyme channel or any like popular kids channel, you're not going to see comments. They've been disabled. What's happening in the background is YouTube is no longer running its higher priced targeted behavioral ads based on like the our surfing or user data on those channels, and that has, as a consequence, like it impacted the creators that were on there. I think, from what I understand, that was sort of balanced out by that happened, and YouTube made that change early 2020, and then a few months later is the pandemic, and since the pandemic, traffic, especially on kids' videos, has just taken off and skyrocketed. And so you almost talk to like some YouTube people who are in like the family and kids space, and like that's sort of evened out in some ways. They paid a lot more attention to, like, they've actually assigned more people to kind of curate YouTube Kids as a safe space, trying to be more attuned to quality. I mean, some of it's a little bit comical. Like, YouTube is said they're going to try to program for subjective traits like humility and compassion in videos that show this, and more recently they've said they're gonna they will be more reluctant to run advertising on YouTube videos that are overtly commercial, and that's been another part of the FTC. There have been complaints that some really popular YouTube Kids videos and channels are effectively like 15, 20-minute long commercials. They're unboxing with a toy. They're playing with a toy. This is a space where on conventional TV, the FCC actually has a lot of rules in place about, you have to mix in a certain amount of educational programming for all the ads and like non-educational programming. You have to add like commercial timing is limited, like product placement. There are rules around that for kids programming. When YouTube came around, there were none of these rules, and another big area is rules on child labor laws and kid actors, and that's still unregulated on YouTube, right? There are no laws that say that a child has to be restricted the number of hours that they can be working shooting YouTube videos. Yeah,
and there's so many big child stars on YouTube, so is that ever going to be an issue that like a regulator is going to watch for?
I think there's certainly advocates who are pushing for the equivalent of the laws in California on YouTube. I think enforcement's difficult in some way, right? Like it's certainly possible, but YouTube, I think, would obviously say we have no idea. Like, if is this person in the video 12 or 13, right? Like, and I think they struggle with this certainly during some of the low points of the moment, right? Like, where you had footage of this was a few years ago, but there was this really popular trend of on YouTube of like people playing pranks, and sometimes it was like pranking kids and like parents pranking kids, and one video of like a father pranking his daughters could be entertaining, but if that person's not the actual parent, it starts to look a little different, right? And YouTube has no way of knowing who the parents are, right? Certainly across millions of videos. Right. But I think those are California now has an additional law around children's privacy, which is, I think, where you're going to see, at least on the advertising business, probably a lot more push for regulation.
How about, in general, how do you foresee Congress regulating YouTube and the large tech platforms? I think one of the biggest bills we're seeing is a big antitrust reform from Senator Amy Klobuchar and Senators Chuck Grassley. Still not, made it to the Senate floor yet. Lots of negotiations, but Google would be captured under that bill if it were to become law. Are there other, what do you foresee on the regulatory front in the U.S. for YouTube and Google?
Certainly anything that changes Section 230 has implications for YouTube. Right. Another big area that is much more YouTube specific is copyright law. And so in Europe, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but Article 17 was the rule around copyright. And this was, I had talked to someone at YouTube that was this was initially being, I think, proposed around 2019, and they said, you don't really appreciate how much of our time in leadership meetings was spent dealing with this copyright law. It would have, in the way it was originally written, at least according to people at YouTube, dramatically changed the way that they do rights management, and made the platform liable for any YouTuber that violated copyright laws. They not only did lobbying, and Google is a powerful and fairly effective lobbying shop. They not only lobbied about that, but they actually encouraged YouTubers to make videos in Europe against the measure. Right? They started like an online campaign. They effectively mobilized their influencers to influence policy, which was effective in the sense that what a judge ruled in Europe that YouTube would not be ultimately liable for copyright. I believe there have been proposals in the U.S. to change copyright law. That case in Europe was brought by a record music industry executive or person that claimed that YouTube was kind of flagrantly using their material without royalties. That has been a consistent complaint from the music industry for a long time, that YouTube was basically like making money off their backs.
Well, and then we have seen California leading, though. They have their own privacy law. The federal government has failed to push forward or advance a federal privacy law, at least right now. There is a bill moving, but running out of time this Congress. So California also recently, their Senate and their Assembly advanced this it's modeled after the UK's age-appropriate design law, which would just basically require tech companies to design their products with children in mind and safety and privacy issues in mind. Obviously,
I think under 18 too, right?
It extends it beyond what we have now as 13 and under is the federal law, and so this would just be in California though. But I'm just kind of curious, like how a YouTube would have to prepare for that. In essence, they're complying in the UK, but but this would be a big deal if it'd have to comply here, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's one, their lawyers are going to be busy for sure.
Right.
There's a lot of more compliance. I think, what my understanding of that bill is pretty limited, but like it would certainly restrict the way that their advertising business operates. And now for that age group of 13 to 18, right? It's
a big group, yeah.
Yeah, it's a big group. It is certainly, there was a Pew study that came out a few weeks ago about teenagers in the U.S. and their usage of social media. And the highest ranking as far as what app do you use constantly, constantly, not just daily. It was YouTube was a leader. So it is YouTube is the first primary screen, sort of the television for that generation. I think YouTube is adjusting their business in a similar way as how they've been adjusting to the changes that Apple has made. So Apple, just be really brief, is restricted cookies, advertising cookies, and third-party targeting on iPhones. And that has undercut a substantial business for social media, for Facebook, for Snapchat, and for YouTube, which made a fair amount of money by getting advertisers in front of videos on iPhones, and where they could say, not only I know where this iPhone is, but I know this iPhone user has watched these particular videos before, clicked on this ad before, I have a lot more data. So without that data, their advertising business suffers. So one thing they've been doing to prepare for that is some machine learning systems to kind of replicate that targeting without collecting the data. They're leaning in a lot on commerce as a business, so trying to get YouTubers to sell things over the platform. Which creators have been doing on their own, but now YouTube is basically building in systems that take commissions. That, I think, has been in place in part because of regulation and in part because of what Apple's been doing. And I think you'll see a lot more of that. I think YouTube was hoping to expand its business to rely less on advertising for those reasons.
Right. Well, Mark, I think we've hit our time. I really appreciate your time and conversation. It was so interesting. I hope everyone reads the book. It was super informative, and look forward to watching what comes from here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, listen to C-SPAN's podcast about books. Learn about the latest nonfiction books and best-selling authors. In each episode, we report on bestsellers lists and book reviews from around the country. You'll also hear authors talking about their latest books and insider interviews with nonfiction book publishing industry experts.